You're standing in the gardens of the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It's the year 67 of the Common Era, and the night air smells like roasting flesh. You can hear screaming from the imperial grounds, but it's distant, muffled by marble walls and the laughter of dinner guests. The emperor is hosting another banquet. You've been invited because you're useful, because you know things, because your silence has been purchased with land and gold. But tonight, you're starting to understand what that silence really costs. A servant walks past, carrying a tray of delicacies. His hands are steady, but you notice the tremor in his jaw. He's seen things. Everyone here has seen things. The man reclining on silk cushions 20 feet away, the man who just quoted Virgil while discussing the qualities of different wines, is the same man who ordered the execution of his own mother. He had her beaten to death with clubs when drowning her didn't work. And that's not even the worst thing he's done. That's not even close. Most people think they know Nero, the emperor who fiddled while Rome burned, the tyrant, the madman, the punchline. But here's what they don't tell you. The cruelty wasn't random. It wasn't madness. It wasn't the product of a disturbed mind. It was a system, a carefully engineered machine of terror that turned the entire Roman Empire into a mechanism for one man's absolute control. And by the time you understand how it worked, you'll realize something far more disturbing. This wasn't the exception. This was the blueprint. This was the future of imperial power laid bare. By the end of this, you're going to understand exactly how Nero transformed Rome from a functioning imperial system into a nightmare state where no one, not senators, not generals, not family members, not even his own wives, was safe. You'll see how he weaponized law, religion, entertainment, and fear into something that made traditional tyranny look restrained. You'll understand the specific mechanisms he used to corrupt every institution of Roman society. And you'll understand why the Romans themselves tried to erase his memory from history and why that erasure failed. If this is gripping you, hit like and subscribe because the next part gets exponentially worse. But before you understand how Nero perfected imperial terror, you need to understand what he inherited. Because the machine was already built. He just learned how to run it without any safety protocols. Nero becomes emperor on the 13th of October in the year 54 of the Common Era. He's 16 years old. He's been prepared for this moment his entire life, but not in the way you might think. His full name is Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, and every single word of that name represents a murder, a political marriage, or both. His great-great-grandfather was Augustus, the first emperor, who established the principle that one man could hold absolute power if he was careful about maintaining republican appearances. His grandfather was Germanicus, the beloved general who died young under circumstances that even ancient historians called suspicious. His adoptive father was Claudius, the emperor who married Nero's mother Agrippina the Younger, and then conveniently died after eating mushrooms that Agrippina may or may not have personally seasoned with poison. This is important, because Nero didn't just inherit power. He inherited a family that had spent 3 generations learning that murder was a legitimate tool of statecraft. That succession wasn't about bloodlines or merit. It was about removing obstacles. Think about the logic of the system. In a traditional hereditary monarchy, succession is clear. The eldest son inherits. The rules are established. Everyone knows what happens next. But Rome still pretended to be a republic. The Senate still convened. Laws still technically mattered. Provincial governors still held imperium, the legal right to command troops. So every emperor had to construct his legitimacy carefully, navigating between republican fiction and imperial reality. They adopted heirs. They married into the right families. They accumulated titles and offices that individually meant little but collectively meant everything. And most importantly, they eliminated rivals before those rivals could gather support. By the time Nero takes power, this process has created something historically new. Not a monarchy, because that would be admitting what Rome had become. Not a republic, because everyone knows that's a fiction. Something else. A system where the emperor's primary skill isn't administration or military strategy, or even political negotiation. It's the management of violence, the ability to deploy force against internal threats while maintaining the appearance of lawful governance. And Nero, he's a genius at it. because he understands something his predecessors didn't or wouldn't admit. His first 5 years are surprisingly stable. Historians call it the Quinquennium Neronis, the 5 good years of Nero. He's advised by Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and one of Rome's wealthiest men, and Sextus Afranius Burrus, the Praetorian prefect who commands the emperor's bodyguard. Together they manage the young emperor. They write his speeches about restoring senatorial privilege. They reduce certain taxes. They provide grain subsidies to keep the urban poor fed. Nero even talks about abolishing all indirect taxes, which would effectively bankrupt the imperial treasury, but sounds wonderfully generous. And here's what people miss about this period. This isn't kindness. This isn't evidence that Nero started good and became corrupted. This is strategy. Because Nero understands something fundamental about imperial power. If you want absolute control, you first need to make people believe you don't want it. You need to establish yourself as reasonable, generous, willing to share power. You need the Senate to think they have influence. You need the people to think you care about their welfare. And then when you start removing the people who threaten you, the institutions that might resist will already be compromised by their earlier complicity in your rule. Watch how this works in practice. In February of the year 55, just 4 months after becoming emperor, Nero faces his first real threat. His stepbrother Britannicus, the biological son of Claudius, is turning 14. That's significant. 14 is old enough to assume the toga of manhood, old enough to be seen as an alternative, old enough for senators who dislike Agrippina's influence to start whispering that maybe the real heir, the actual blood son of the previous emperor, should rule instead of the adopted one. So Nero invites Britannicus to a family dinner. It's a small gathering, intimate, the kind of meal where the emperor shows favor by including you. And during the meal, Britannicus is served wine. He takes a drink, complains it's too hot, and asks for cold water to be added. The water is added. Britannicus drinks, and within moments he's convulsing on the floor. He's dead before anyone can react. Nero doesn't stand up. He doesn't call for physicians. He tells the assembled guests that Britannicus has suffered from epileptic fits since childhood, that this was entirely expected, that everyone should continue eating. The body is removed. The dinner continues. And the message is transmitted with perfect clarity to everyone in that room. I can kill my own brother in front of witnesses, in my own home, and nothing will happen to me. The system will protect this, you will protect this, because if you don't, you're next. But here's the thing that's easy to miss. Nero doesn't arrest anyone for questioning Britannicus's death. He doesn't purge the Senate of potential sympathizers. He doesn't need to, because everyone who was at that dinner, everyone who heard about it, everyone in the aristocratic network of Rome now understands the real rule. The emperor doesn't need subtlety. He doesn't need plausible deniability. He doesn't need to hide what he's doing. The system will adapt to whatever he chooses to do. Now, watch what happens over the next 3 years. Nero consolidates power through what looks like generosity and public service. He builds public works. He sponsors games that are more elaborate and more frequent than his predecessors provided. He performs in theaters and sings in public performances, which absolutely scandalizes the aristocracy, because emperors aren't supposed to lower themselves to the level of actors, but makes him wildly popular with the masses, who see it as the emperor connecting with them directly. And all the while, he's watching, learning who's loyal, who's useful, who's dangerous, who has influence independent of him. Because in the year 59, Nero decides to eliminate the one person who still has real power over him, his mother, Agrippina. This is where you start to see the true scope of Nero's capacity for cruelty, because killing his mother isn't enough. If he just has her quietly poisoned, it accomplishes the goal but sends the wrong message. It suggests he's afraid of her, that he has to hide what he's doing. No. Nero needs to do this in a way that demonstrates he's beyond all constraints, that maternal authority means nothing, that he can kill the woman who made him emperor and face zero consequences. So he plans something theatrical, something that will become legendary for its combination of engineering and malice. He invites Agrippina to a festival at Baiae, a luxurious resort town on the Bay of Naples where the wealthy go to escape Rome's heat. He's been feuding with her. She's been meddling in imperial policy, reminding senators that she's the one who secured Nero's position, but now he's apologetic, affectionate. He wants to reconcile. He offers her a special boat to take her home across the bay after the festival, a beautiful vessel, a gift, and the boat is designed to collapse. The ceiling of the cabin is weighted with lead. The mechanism is triggered once they're in deep water. The ceiling falls, the hull breaks apart, and Agrippina goes into the water. Except she survives. She's an excellent swimmer. She makes it to shore. And now Nero has a catastrophic problem, because the assassination attempt is completely obvious to everyone. The boat was too elaborate. Too many people were involved in its construction. His mother is alive, and she knows, and the whole imperial court knows, and this should destroy him. In a normal political system, this would be the end. The Senate would have grounds to intervene. The Praetorian Guard might switch allegiance to preserve the dynasty. Public opinion would turn. But Nero doesn't panic. He doesn't flee. He doesn't try to negotiate. Instead, he sends a detachment of Praetorian guardsmen to Agrippina's villa. They break down the door, they find her in her bedroom, and they beat her to death with clubs while she's trying to plead with them, trying to remind them of who she is, trying to invoke her authority as the emperor's mother and the great-granddaughter of Augustus. It doesn't matter. The soldiers follow their orders, and when they're finished, they leave her body where it fell. Then Nero returns to Rome and makes an announcement. His mother, he declares, was plotting against him. She was gathering support for a coup. She planned to have him assassinated and install herself as regent for a more pliable heir. But the plot was discovered, and rather than face trial and execution, Agrippina took her own life. He's grieving, of course, but he's also grateful to the gods for protecting him from matricide, from being forced to execute his own mother. The Senate congratulates him. They vote thanksgivings to the temples. They send delegations to praise his clemency for not punishing Agrippina's alleged co-conspirators, for forgiving those who might have been deceived by her schemes. They compete with each other to craft the most elaborate praise for the emperor's escape from such a dangerous woman. Think about what just happened. Nero tried to kill his mother with a collapsing boat. When that failed, he sent soldiers to beat her to death in her bedroom. Then he returned to Rome and told a lie so transparent that it insulted the intelligence of everyone who heard it. And the entire governmental structure of the Roman Empire, the Senate that still technically held legislative power, publicly endorsed the lie. Not because anyone believed it, but because everyone understood that the emperor's power now included the power to rewrite reality itself, to declare that up is down, that murder is self-defense, that witnesses didn't see what they saw. And that's when Nero realizes something crucial. He doesn't need to be careful anymore. The institutions won't stop him. Public opinion won't stop him. Even family bonds won't stop him. There are no brakes on this vehicle. For the next several years, Nero indulges himself. He builds, he performs, he travels. He marries Poppaea Sabina after divorcing his first wife Octavia, who's then exiled and murdered on suspicion of adultery. When Poppaea dies in the year 65, allegedly because Nero kicked her while she was pregnant, he has her deified. He then marries a boy named Sporus who resembles Poppaea and has him castrated so he can play the role of empress. None of this is hidden. It's all public, imperial policy. And then the year 64 arrives, and everything changes. On the night of July 18th, in the year 64 of the Common Era, fire breaks out in Rome. It starts in the merchant district near the Circus Maximus, in the shops and warehouses that line the great arena where chariot races are held. The wind is strong that night. The streets are narrow. The buildings are primarily wooden tenements, apartment blocks stacked 5 and 6 stories high, packed with poor families who can't afford the stone houses on the hills. And the fire spreads. For 6 days, Rome burns. The flames consume entire neighborhoods. They jump the Tiber River. They destroy temples that have stood for centuries. 10 of Rome's 14 administrative districts are damaged. 3 are completely destroyed. The death toll runs into the thousands. Hundreds of thousands of people lose their homes, their possessions, everything they own. The city that has stood as the center of the Mediterranean world for 7 centuries is suddenly a landscape of ash and rubble. Nero is at Antium, his birthplace 35 miles from Rome, when the fire starts. He races back to the city, and actually does many of the right things. He opens the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, as temporary shelter. He opens public buildings and even his own gardens. He brings in grain from Ostia at his own expense to feed the displaced. He organizes firefighting brigades and personally directs some of the demolition work to create fire breaks. But here's what people notice. Here's what becomes the story. While the city is still smoldering, while refugees are still searching the ruins for family members, Nero orders the construction of his new palace to begin. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a massive complex that will eventually cover between 100 and 300 acres in the very heart of Rome, built on land that was densely populated before the fire and is now conveniently empty. And people start asking questions. Did Nero start the fire? Did he order it set to clear space for his architectural ambitions? The sources disagree. Tacitus, writing 50 years later, says some people accused Nero, but others defended him. Suetonius, writing 60 years later, claims Nero watched the fire from the Tower of Maecenas and sang about the fall of Troy while playing his lyre. Cassius Dio, writing 150 years later, says Nero openly ordered the fire set. But here's what matters more than the historical truth. People believed he could have done it, because by the year 64, everyone in Rome knows that Nero's cruelty has no bottom, that there's no act too monstrous, no crime too enormous to be plausible coming from this emperor. So Nero needs a scapegoat, and he finds one in a relatively new religious sect that most Romans barely know exists: the Christians. Now listen very carefully to how this works, because this is where Nero's genius for systematized cruelty becomes crystal clear. He doesn't just arrest Christians, he doesn't just execute them. He transforms their deaths into state-sponsored entertainment on a scale Rome has never quite seen before. He has them covered in animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena. He has them crucified in his gardens and set on fire to serve as illumination for his evening parties, their burning bodies lighting the pathways while guests stroll beneath. He stages elaborate executions during public games, dressing Christians as characters from mythology and having them killed in ways that match the myths. A woman dressed as Dirce, dragged to death by a bull. A man dressed as Icarus, thrown from a height so his flight ends in impact. And he does all of this publicly as official imperial policy, with the full apparatus of Roman law identifying these people as criminals, guilty of arson and hatred of the human race. Think about the mechanism. Nero isn't just punishing criminals. He's using state resources, public venues, legal categories, and bureaucratic procedures to transform human beings into props for mass entertainment. He's taking the traditional Roman practice of executing criminals during games, which served a pedagogical function about the consequences of crime, and weaponizing it into a tool for managing public opinion and demonstrating imperial power. The message to Rome is multi-layered and clear. To the masses, I burned down your city and I'm rebuilding it as my personal paradise, but look, here are the real villains. Watch them burn instead of blaming me. To the aristocracy, I can identify any group as enemies of the state and the legal system will process them to death. To the Christians themselves, your God won't save you. Your faith means nothing against imperial power. And for a few years it works. The persecution satisfies public anger. The construction of the Domus Aurea proceeds. Nero's power seems unassailable. But here's the thing about systems built on perpetual terror. They require constant escalation. Once you've killed your mother, your stepbrother, your wives, and thousands of religious minorities, what's left? How do you maintain the fear that keeps people compliant when everyone's already afraid? How do you demonstrate that no one is safe when you've already killed almost everyone close to you? Nero finds the answer. You start killing the people who thought they were safe, the loyal ones, the competent ones, the ones who helped you. In the spring of the year 65, a conspiracy forms. It's called the Pisonian Conspiracy, named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, the senator who nominally leads it. The plan is relatively simple. Assassinate Nero during the games at Baiae, install Piso as emperor, restore some semblance of senatorial governance. But the conspiracy is huge. It includes senators, equestrians, military officers, even members of the Praetorian Guard. At least 41 people are directly involved, and probably more on the periphery. It's the largest plot against an emperor in Roman history up to that point, and it fails because someone talks. A freedman named Milicus, whose patron is involved, goes to Nero with the information, and Nero's response reveals the final evolution of his cruelty, the ultimate refinement of his system. He doesn't just execute the conspirators. He uses the conspiracy as legal justification to purge everyone he's ever suspected of disloyalty, everyone who's ever questioned him, everyone whose competence or popularity might someday threaten him. The list of the dead reads like a catalogue of Rome's most accomplished men. Seneca, his old tutor and advisor, is forced to commit suicide even though his actual involvement in the plot is questionable at best. Lucan, the poet who wrote the Pharsalia, is forced to commit suicide. His father and uncle are forced to commit suicide. Piso himself is forced to commit suicide. Petronius, the arbiter of taste at Nero's court, the author of the Satyricon, is forced to commit suicide when Nero suspects him of disloyalty, even though he wasn't part of the conspiracy. Thrasea Paetus, a senator known for stoic virtue, is forced to commit suicide. Berea Soranus, another senator, is forced to commit suicide. And here's the pattern you need to notice. Nero doesn't have these men arrested and publicly executed like common criminals. He doesn't put them on trial where they might speak in their own defense. Instead, he sends them a message through an imperial freedman. The message is simple. The emperor has determined you are disloyal. You have one day to settle your affairs. Then you will open your veins. This is presented as mercy, as clemency. The condemned men get to die in their homes, with their families around them, in the traditional Roman manner of suicide, opening their veins in a warm bath so they fade away peacefully. They get to preserve their dignity, distribute their property, say goodbye. They get to die like Romans instead of criminals. But think about what this really means. These men don't get trials. They don't get to present evidence. They don't get to confront their accusers. They don't get to speak publicly about their reasons for opposing the emperor, about the legitimacy of their grievances, about the systematic terror that drove them to conspiracy. Their deaths look voluntary, which means Nero isn't technically a murderer. He's just a ruler who's very good at making people choose death over the alternative. And what's the alternative? That's where the real cruelty lives. Because Nero doesn't tell them explicitly. He doesn't need to. Everyone knows. If you refuse the gift of suicide, you'll be arrested. Your property will be confiscated before you're executed, leaving your family destitute. You'll be tortured for information about other conspirators. Your wives, your children, your freed slaves might be tortured too. You'll die in the arena, slowly for entertainment. You'll die without dignity, without control, in maximum pain and humiliation. So suicide becomes the rational choice, the merciful option. And that's the true genius of Nero's system. He's created conditions where his enemies kill themselves, where the legal structures of Rome process dissidents to death without the emperor having to visibly violate any laws. Think about how this feels if you're a senator in the year 66. You've seen Britannicus poisoned at dinner. You've seen Agrippina murdered and the Senate applaud the transparent cover story. You've seen thousands of Christians burned alive as public entertainment. You've seen the most accomplished men of your generation, your friends, your colleagues, your relatives, forced to commit suicide on the basis of suspicion or confession extracted under torture. And now you have to go to the Senate every day and vote on Nero's proposals and compete with other senators to praise his wisdom more elaborately and pretend that everything is fine, that this is normal governance, that you're grateful for his leadership. Because if you show fear, that's suspicious. That suggests you have something to hide. If you show anger, that's treason. That's evidence of disloyalty. If you withdraw from public life, that's even worse. That suggests you're plotting in private. There's no safe choice. The system is designed so that survival is essentially random, dependent entirely on the emperor's mood, on whether someone denounces you to gain favor, on whether Nero needs to demonstrate his power that particular week. And that's the real purpose. Nero isn't trying to eliminate specific enemies. He's trying to eliminate the possibility of organized opposition. He's transforming Rome from a political system with factions and debates and power struggles into a psychological prison where everyone's afraid all the time, where no one trusts anyone, where the rational response to imperial power is absolute submission. Now here's where it gets even worse, where the cruelty transcends violence and enters the realm of cultural destruction. In the year 66, Nero tours Greece. He participates in the Olympic Games and every other major pan-Hellenic athletic and artistic competition, and he wins every single contest. Not because he's the most skilled, not because he's trained the hardest, because he's the emperor, and the judges understand what will happen if they rule against him. He wins the chariot race at Olympia, even though he falls out of his chariot and doesn't finish the race. The judges declare that his intention to finish counts as completion. He wins singing competitions where he's the only competitor. He wins acting contests where the other performers deliberately perform poorly to make him look good. He wins lyre-playing competitions despite being mediocre at best. By the time he returns to Rome in the year 68, he's accumulated over 1,800 victory crowns, and when he returns, he celebrates with a triumph. The traditional Roman victory parade, the highest honor the state can bestow, reserved for generals who have conquered foreign territories and expanded the empire. Except Nero isn't celebrating a military victory. He's celebrating his victories in Greek singing competitions. He processes through Rome in a purple robe, standing in the chariot traditionally used by triumphant generals, while the crowds cheer and senators walk behind him, and the Senate votes him special honors for his artistic achievements. This matters because it shows how completely Nero has corrupted every institution and tradition of Roman society. The games, which were supposed to honor the gods and demonstrate virtue through competition, are now mechanisms for flattering the emperor. The triumph, which was supposed to celebrate the expansion of Roman power through legitimate military achievement, is now a celebration of Nero's artistic pretensions. Even objective reality is negotiable. Nero fell out of a chariot and didn't finish a race, and therefore he won the race. That's official. That's recorded, that's what happened. Even the calendar itself is corrupted. Nero renames the month of April as Neroneus. May becomes Claudius after his adoptive father. June becomes Germanicus after his grandfather. He's literally trying to rewrite time itself around his own family's glory, to make the measurement of days itself a monument to imperial power. And here's what you need to understand. None of this is accidental. None of this is madness. This isn't a case of power corrupting a weak mind. This is what absolute power looks like when all the informal checks on imperial authority collapse, because Rome never solved the fundamental problem of the Principate. They created a system where one man held total power, but everyone pretended he didn't. And that pretense worked as long as the emperor was willing to maintain it, to respect the fiction of senatorial authority, to govern within traditional bounds even if those bounds weren't legally enforceable. But Nero stopped pretending. And once he did, everyone discovered that there was nothing underneath. No law the emperor couldn't ignore, no institution he couldn't corrupt, no person he couldn't kill, no tradition he couldn't violate. The entire structure of Roman governance was revealed to be decorative, maintained only by imperial self-restraint, which Nero did not possess. But here's the thing about systems built purely on terror. They're ultimately fragile, because fear isn't loyalty. Fear ensures compliance in the moment, but it doesn't create genuine support. It doesn't inspire people to defend the system when it's threatened. And eventually, even in a structure designed to prevent resistance, someone finds a way to say no. In March of the year 68, Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, declares rebellion. His forces are small. His military prospects are poor. He commands perhaps 8,000 to 10,000 men, most of them poorly trained Gallic auxiliaries. Against the full might of the Roman legions, he has no realistic chance of victory. But he's not trying to win militarily. He's trying to prove that rebellion is possible, that someone can say no and survive long enough to make it public. And that's enough. Within weeks, other governors join. Servius Sulpicius Galba in Spain, Marcus Salvius Otho in Lusitania. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own bodyguards, begins to waver. They haven't been paid their promised bonuses. They're tired of guarding an emperor who spends his time performing in theaters. And they're calculating whether Nero can survive this, whether they should stay loyal or pick a winner. In June of the year 68, the Senate meets, and in an astonishing reversal, they declare Nero a public enemy. They vote to execute him in the traditional manner, to be stripped naked, have his head placed in a wooden fork, and be beaten to death with rods. This is the same Senate that applauded the murder of Agrippina, that praised Nero's artistic victories, that voted him divine honors. But Nero's power was always based on their complicity, and the moment they sense that the military is wavering, that complicity evaporates. Nero flees Rome. He takes refuge in a villa 4 miles outside the city, owned by one of his freedmen. He plans to escape to Egypt, to plead with the Eastern legions to somehow reassemble his power. But none of his servants will help him. None of his guards will protect him. The villa's overseer refuses to provide horses for his escape. He's completely alone. The emperor who commanded absolute power over millions of people can't find a single person willing to help him flee. And when he hears the cavalry coming to arrest him, when he realizes there's no escape, he tries to commit suicide. But he can't do it. His hands are shaking too badly to position the blade correctly. He tries several times and fails. So finally he has his private secretary, a man named Epaphroditus, help him. He presses the blade to his own throat, while Epaphroditus pushes, and Nero bleeds out on the floor of a freedman's villa. His last words are reportedly, "Qualis artifex perio." What an artist the world is losing. Even in death he can't stop performing, can't admit what he really was. In his final moments, facing the end of everything, he still sees himself as a misunderstood genius rather than a tyrant who terrorized an empire. The Senate orders his body denied proper burial. They vote to tear down his statues. They erase his name from public inscriptions. They attempt damnatio memoriae, the damnation of memory, the closest thing Rome has to erasing someone from history. And for about 50 years, it partially works. Nero becomes the emperor you're not supposed to talk about in polite company, the example of imperial power taken to its most horrifying conclusion. But here's the aftermath that should genuinely terrify you, because Nero's death doesn't end the system he perfected. It doesn't restore the Republic. It doesn't fix the fundamental problem. It just shows other emperors what's possible, what they can get away with if they're willing to ignore the constraints. Domitian, who rules from the year 81 to 96, copies Nero's tactics almost exactly. Random purges of senators based on suspicion, forced suicides, show trials where the verdict is predetermined, and the trial serves only to provide legal cover for murder. The transformation of law from a constraint on power into a weapon of imperial control. And when Domitian is finally assassinated, the pattern continues. Commodus, the son of Marcus Aurelius, takes it even further in the late 2nd century. He doesn't just perform in theaters like Nero. He fights as a gladiator in the arena, forcing senators to watch him kill animals and disabled fighters. He renames Rome itself as Colonia Commodiana. He declares himself the reincarnation of Hercules and demands to be worshipped as a living god. And after Commodus, the system fractures completely. The year of the 5 emperors in 193, the year of the 6 emperors in 238, decades where the imperial office is auctioned to the highest bidder by the Praetorian Guard, where emperors are murdered by their own soldiers within months of taking power, where the pretense of law collapses entirely and the empire is revealed as what it always was, a military dictatorship wearing the costume of republican government. Nero didn't break the Roman Empire, but he revealed what it really was. He ripped away the pretense and showed everyone the machine underneath, a mechanism that could transform any man into a monster as long as that man held absolute power and was willing to use it. And once that revelation was made, it couldn't be taken back. Every subsequent emperor had to govern knowing that everyone knew. That the laws were optional, that the Senate was decorative, that power came from the legions and from the Praetorian Guard, and anyone who commanded their loyalty could do anything. Think about what this means for the next 3 centuries of Roman history. Every emperor has to struggle with the same problem Nero created. How do you hold absolute power without becoming a tyrant? How do you maintain the loyalty of the army, the Senate, the people, when everyone knows that loyalty can be rewarded with death just as easily as betrayal? How do you govern a system that's revealed itself to be ungovernable except through terror? Some emperors solved this by being genuinely competent administrators: Marcus Aurelius, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius. They used the power of the office to actually govern effectively, to maintain infrastructure, to defend borders, to administer justice. But they're the exceptions. And even they govern knowing that their power rests ultimately on the same foundation as Nero's: military force and the willingness to use violence against internal threats. Most emperors just manage the terror more carefully than Nero did. They kill people quietly. They maintain the legal fictions. They don't burn Christians as torches in their gardens where everyone can see. They understand that the system requires some pretense, some deniability, some maintenance of traditional forms. But the underlying reality never changes. And that's the real horror of Nero's reign. Not the individual cruelties, though those were monstrous. Not the specific murders, though each one represents a human tragedy. The real horror is that he proved how fragile civilization is. How quickly law can become decoration, how easily institutions can be corrupted, how completely one person can dominate millions if they're willing to ignore every moral and legal boundary, and if the system they inherit is designed to concentrate power without effective checks. He took a governmental structure that was supposed to prevent tyranny, that contained elaborate mechanisms meant to balance power between emperor, senate, army, and people, and he demonstrated that all those mechanisms were optional, that they functioned only as long as the emperor chose to respect them, and once someone chose not to, once someone revealed that the emperor's power was actually absolute and the rest was theater, that knowledge couldn't be erased. Every emperor after Nero governed in his shadow. Every senator after Nero knew that their power was conditional. Every citizen after Nero understood that the law would protect them only if the emperor allowed it. The empire continued for another 400 years in the west, another 1,000 in the east. But it was never the same. Nero had shown everyone what Rome really was, and you can't unsee that. So here's the question you should be asking yourself. What institutions in our own time are designed to prevent the concentration of power? What checks and balances exist in modern systems? What mechanisms are supposed to prevent tyranny? And what would happen if someone came along who was willing to test those boundaries, to ignore those constraints, to reveal whether they're actually enforceable or just traditional? Because Nero's lesson isn't that some people are monsters. History is full of cruel people. His lesson is that the right system can enable any cruel person to become a monster on an imperial scale. That institutions without enforcement are just suggestions, that laws without the will to uphold them are just words. And once a system exists that concentrates power in one person or one office, the only thing preventing another Nero is the self-restraint of whoever holds that power, which is a terrifying thing to depend on, because self-restraint is voluntary. And history suggests it's rare. If this has fundamentally changed how you think about power, about the fragility of institutions, about what prevents tyranny, hit like and subscribe. Leave a comment telling me, what historical figure should be covered next? Who else built a system of cruelty that was more calculated, more systematic than we remember? Because next time, we're looking at someone who made Nero look restrained, someone who turned an entire continent into an extraction machine. And when you understand how they built that system, how it functioned, how it was legally justified, you'll never think about colonial authority the same way again. And that is what really happened.